Hi, everyone. I'm John Carlson from the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University, and welcome to this online event, COVID-19, Religion and Humanity, Dispatches from the Frontlines. To those of you who are used to coming to our events on campus, I so wish we could all be there together. I miss all of you all very much, and I know that day will come again soon. Hang in there. I can't wait. But in the meantime, I have always wanted to open up my home to all of you, and even if it is during a global pandemic. So welcome to my office, and welcome to this event. We also encourage you to tell your friends about it, because while this is a live event now, they'll be able to watch it on their website later on. And that goes for anybody who's tuning in a little bit late or misses part of it. As you know, the work of the center goes on. We continue to do important work, and we're doing and sharing some of that work with our faculty affiliates via videos and things like that. You can also learn about the launch of our new Recovering Truth project. Stay tuned for more information there, and you can check out our website. Just a quick programming note on this format that we're doing. If you have questions that you'd like to submit during the Q&A period, you can type them at any point into the comments chat section or to the live chat section on YouTube. Or if you're having trouble there, you can also email them to Matt, M-A-T-T, .Correa, C-O-R-R-E-A, at asu.edu. And we will do our best to ensure we get to all of those questions as we can. Joining me moderating today is Tracy Fessenden, who is Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Center. And of course, our two awesome panelists, Father Patrick Gilger and Dr. Anand Gopal. Very, very brief introductions, and then we're going to jump right into it. Father Patrick Gilger is a Jesuit priest. He is an award-winning author and culture editor at America Magazine, also a fellow at Public Seminar. He lives in New York City, where he's completing his PhD in sociology at the New School for Social Research. But he joins us today from Milan, Italy, where he has been since just prior to the quarantine's imposition last month. Anand Gopal, as many of you know, is also an award-winning journalist, also a sociologist, who also lives in New York City, where he is joining us today. Like Patrick, he also spent the early part of the pandemic in quarantine. And as you know, he's an assistant research professor here in the center. He's been working with the World Health Organization to coordinate COVID relief in northern Syria and volunteering to provide COVID relief to underserved communities in the Bronx. So to start us off with our conversation today, Tracy, you want to get us going?
Sure, John, thank you. I just want to say thank you also to all our audience members who are tuning in. Like John, I miss you. I'm very eager to see you again when we can gather safely. And I am delighted to welcome Father Patrick Gilger and Anand Gopal. We're delighted to have you here. And I'm interested, as all of our audience members are interested, in hearing your impressions of the pandemic, your own experiences, what you've observed, particularly in light of any religious dimension that has made a strong impression on you. So if you might want to just say a little bit about that, Patrick, let's start with you. Can you just share a little bit about your own experiences in the pandemic?
Yeah, of course, Tracy. Thank you guys for inviting me. It's really good to be here, privileged to be here with you, Anand. So thank you for this. As I said, as you said, John, I'm here in Milan, Italy. So it's dark outside my window. So usually I can see on a clear day. This morning was real clear, and I can see the Alps, just the tips of the Alps over the horizon of the skyline of the city. And just to the south here, which would be out this window, you could look out, I can see just the tiny, tiny hint of the tip of the Duomo, the cathedral here in Milan. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. But even a view that good gets a little stagnant after about 2 months. So the Italian quarantine, as some of you may know, has been a little more serious with regard to its consequences than the quarantine in different places in the United States. Similar to many other places in the world, though. Italy's has been similar to many other places in the world. Here, for the last 6 or 7 weeks now, like a couple weeks after I arrived, to be honest. We've had a very serious lockdown where people are only allowed outside to go shopping, to go to the doctor, to go to the dentist, for some work exceptions, but travel around the city is not permitted. Going for runs in the park, which I was able to do once before that began, not permitted. Those kinds of things. And in the midst of this, our community, there are 7 of us here in the community. I'm living at one of our high schools, the Jesuit High School in Milan, just northwest of downtown. And there are 7 of us here, and we've built, I'm sure like many families, kind of a little surprising intimacy and ad hoc community here. We get to celebrate Mass together, which I know many Catholics have been deprived of, so I feel very privileged that way. But it's been a strange experience being in the 4 walls of this room for such a long time. At the same time, realize how privileged I am to even be safe and to have a place like this to withdraw to. So,
thank you, Anand. How about you?
Well, I came back home to New York, like I'd say 2 months ago. So just before the pandemic really hit hard here. So for better or for worse, I've been here through all of it. And it's interesting because I'm coming at this from a perspective in which I have a lot of my family members and close friends and loved ones who are healthcare workers. My parents are doctors. I know a lot of people who are in the health field. And I myself, as you said, I'm a journalist and a sociologist, but I also do a lot of public health work. So I've been looking at this from that angle. And what's interesting is on my street, every day at 7 p.m., everybody comes out onto the balconies and onto the rooftops and cheers for healthcare workers. And there's signs all around the city saying we should support our healthcare workers. People are honking their horns. And when I first saw this, I thought this was beautiful. And this is like an amazing testament to people's spirit and their sense of supporting our most important workers right now. But in talking to my family members and talking to my friends, I began to get a slightly different view of this. So just to give you a little window into why that is the case, just yesterday, a friend of a friend, he's a physician, died of COVID. He was treating patients. A couple of weeks ago, a 27-year-old resident died of treating an illness. This is up in the Bronx. Nurses across the city don't actually have PPEs, and I'm sure everyone's heard of that in the news if they don't have that, but what they have are surgical masks in most cases, which are inadequate to do the job. But in some places, like in the Bronx, in Montefiore Hospital, for instance, they were wearing rain ponchos. And rain ponchos will do a good job of keeping water off your face, but not very good at stopping viruses. When nurses and other healthcare workers tried to publicize this, many of them were threatened with their jobs. They were threatened to be fired. There was a physician actually who was fired. At the same time as that, residents, and I have friends who are residents, and our residents are people who are training to be doctors, right? And they are doctors. They're the ones who are doing most of the actual legwork in the ER and in the ICUs. Residents normally by law are supposed to work no more than 80 hours a week. Now that law has been lifted. Now they're working 90 or 100, 110 hours a week. There was a study that just came out that said 1 in 5 residents have expressed thoughts of suicide in the last month. In NYU, which is my alma mater, NYU residents have petitioned for hazard pay and for better equipment, and the nurses have petitioned for this as well. It was rejected by NYU, citing cost and other things, even though the CEO of NYU's hospital makes $5.5 million a year. So when I began to understand this, I began to look at what I saw at first was the cheering for healthcare workers in a bit of a different light. It made me question the priorities of our society. And it actually made me think about my other line of work as a war reporter, where everywhere we go, we turn on the television and we're told we should support our troops. There's all sorts of holidays for supporting our troops. We thank troops for their service. But in my street, every day when I go to the subway, I pass homeless veterans. So in terms of the moral priorities of our society, it really, I think, laid bare for me some questions that I hope we can get into.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a wonderful example of something that a lot of us have been wondering about, wanting to ask you about. Both of you are sociologists, both of you are journalists, and academics and journalists obviously have a strong sense of vocation. Anand, you've just shown us that you haven't stopped being a journalist or a war reporter in lockdown. But Patty, you're also a Jesuit priest, so you have that other vocation. And I'm just wondering if you want to say a little more, just to add a little bit to what you've already said about how you're living your vocation in lockdown. And you've given us some great examples, but if you just want to say a little bit more, and maybe start again with Anand, how do you feel like, how are you living your vocation as a journalist and as a sociologist in quarantine?
Well, it's funny. The first 2 weeks of the quarantine, I was sitting and watching what was happening and feeling pretty useless. And then I decided, you know what, I should go and try to do some reporting. Well, first I said, well, it's too dangerous. Then I said, well, I'm a war reporter, so I should just go out and do this anyway. And so I went up to the Bronx and began to follow people around who were distributing food, mostly to public housing projects. These are basically very low-income neighborhoods, and these are housing projects that have been up since the 60s and 70s. They're in pretty bad shape. Some of them don't have running water. They have power outages. And I thought I would just follow some of the locals there in distributing food and distributing aid, just to see kind of like how people are trying to survive under these circumstances. But what's interesting is that after a few days of doing that, I felt pretty inadequate as a journalist, because I felt that just sitting here and watching this and trying to relate it, when this is my community, I should be doing more. And similarly in Syria, so I'm writing a book on Syria. It's a journalistic book, but I've kind of been drawn in Syria to also trying to get more involved and try to roll my sleeves up, so to speak, to be able to help out. So now I'm working on, or helping assist the coronavirus response in a couple of cities in Syria, both of which I think stem from this broader sense that I have that being a journalist for me personally is inadequate at this time, and I feel like I should be doing something more.
Yeah, Anand, I really appreciate your honesty there. Not just the honesty, like the vulnerability that's like laced in with the honesty there. It's something resonating with me in that, especially with the desire to do more. And for me, I feel like for myself, you know, I feel this kind of constitutive, like relentless incapacity to live up to that desire in myself. Sometimes that can be, like all-consuming interiorly, turns into what I'm a Jesuit priest. And so we have this kind of very idiosyncratic Jesuit language that we use to describe our experiences sometimes, which you as a sociologist will be well-versed in. But we have all this particular language. The word for us would be consolation or desolation, like inner movements that flow out into the world that draw us, towards God or move us away from God. And for me, that experience of not being able to live up to these deep desires that are really there, really restless in me, often it can go either direction. It can be either a consolation or a desolation for me. But I find in this moment, especially with the strictures that are put on, my own capacity to do the kinds of things that I would normally want to do to respond, whether those things are liturgical responses, pastoral responses, whether they're academic responses, whether I'm I spent a lot of time at the Catholic Worker in New York City, working with the homeless down there, or other places, we could all list. Regardless of what they are, that incapacity to do those things, showing me something of that constitutive nature of it is really what I want to say. And I don't know, like Pope Francis, he's an incredible role model for me forever. I do not know him, but I feel like as a Jesuit, himself being a Jesuit, there's this sense of familiarity in the way that he conducts himself in the world, and the way that a lot of my Jesuit mentors, the men who've taught me, or have tried to teach me, mostly failed to teach me because of my own failure to learn how to live, gently in the world, like what we would say as a contemplative in action. I just see a lot of this in him. And the image that strikes me there, and then one thing that he said, that the image that strikes me is he gave this impromptu Urbi et Orbi blessing and address from St. Peter's Square. And normally these are massive events, like they're major events in the Catholic world and often in the religious world, where the Pope, maybe a little presumptuously, but has for many years taken it upon himself to bless the entire world, all of creation. So Urbi, bless the city, Orbi, bless the world. And this was not the scheduled time to do one of these blessings, but Pope Francis has this real deep pastoral intuition to say, now is a time when we try to offer something in the midst of a moment of real sense of helplessness or incapacity, like we're describing. So he's out there, many of you may have seen, he's in St. Peter's Square alone, in the rain, in the darkness. And he's an old man, you know, he's 84, I believe. And he's limping his way up the steps to this platform to pray, and then offering these like very gentle words about a world that's almost overwhelmed by this tempest, this storm of a pandemic. And then what he does is what he always does, is he challenges us to realize that not everyone has the same quality of boat in this pandemic, and that one of the responses that the church needs to be making, that I really resonate with the desire for journalists making. Many people in my family are journalists as well. I love that desire to offer this recognition and then response. Last thing from me. A word that he's been using to describe this moment is apocalyptic. And it's a dangerous word to use, to be honest, because it's so easily misunderstood. What Pope Francis means has nothing to do with the fact that this may be some, predictive sign of an impending end of the world. Like, this has nothing to do with this. What he means is what the Greeks meant, that apocalypse just means to be revealed, to be revealed. So things are being revealed that are just normally hidden in this moment. It's not that they don't exist, they're just covered over. And a lot of those things are what you're naming. And I'm like, this stuff's happening. Those buildings are that way all around us right now. Refugees that are trying to come across, the Mediterranean Sea to Italy and to other places are vulnerable all the time, not just now. At our own borders in the United States, et cetera, we can all think, but we are vulnerable in that same way. And that is the other thing that I think this virus is showing us, that, as Americans, I just do not think we are comfortable with. One of the major experiences I've had here in Italy is that Italians, look, they have a lot of responses here, and I do not want to pretend that I understand Italians to their core, I do not. But I just notice how different kind of my own visceral internal response is to not being able to control than theirs is. They still want to do the right things, to respond. They're still angry, they're still frustrated, but there's a comfortability with their own vulnerability as human beings, that the world is not fully malleable to their wills. Something I really want to take into myself, both as a thinker and as a pastor.
Hey, Father Patty, can I jump in here? Because as you're talking about this, I was remembering this line in this beautiful article that you wrote from American Magazine, where you were talking about your Lenten penance that many of us actually experienced, you in a particularly intensive way. But you were talking about this renunciation of this particular version of our American response to fear that I have made my own. And you go on to say that's this unceasing effort to control, to master, to define, and thereby dictate what is really real and truly true, and thereby secure. I just was so eloquently put, and I think it gets to one of the things that we've thinking about, and we've got some other questions we want to get to later about this as well, which is just how do we understand the differences of what contexts we're in and how they respond. We tend to think that, there's two ways in this country, there's two ways to respond to this. You're either supporting and strongly in support of social distancing, or you're kind of the back to work movement or something in between. That's not the only range of alternatives here. So, you mentioned a little bit, Patty, about Italy. Maybe Anand, tell us a little bit how are things different in other countries you've seen and been observing in Europe, or what you know about Syria or other places. We'll start with you, Anand, and go back to Patty.
Sure. There's a real awareness, I think, in places like Syria of human vulnerability, which perhaps is lost in other parts of the world. Syria, of course, is a country that's been through a tremendous amount in the last 8 or 9 years. Probably the most horrific war of the 21st century, massive refugee crisis, etc. So for many there, this is seen as the latest in a series of trials, essentially, that they've faced in the last 8 or 9 years. But what's interesting is that because they've gone through the previous 8 years, where they weren't just, maybe this is how it's viewed in the news, as the Syrians were just victims of this horrible war, but actually there was a revolution in Syria. There was people who rose up and overthrew their government in parts of the country. They actually had a quasi-democratic experiment where they tried self-rule. A lot of this actually taught them ways of dealing with all sorts of horrific things, because they recognize how they have to rely on each other and their community in times of horror. And I think, again, I see flashes of that in places like the Bronx, but the difference is in the Bronx, where there's such a deep-seated cynicism that's, I think, justified, because they've just been either completely neglected or worse, been the target of pretty terrible policies for so many years, without the ability of having been able to organize and fight back in any consistent way. So that's, I think, one important difference. There's a lot of differences that you can draw between the two. There's another example, for instance, is in Syria. If you walk down Membej, which is a city in northeastern Syria where I'm writing my book in, you will not see homeless people. Doesn't mean there's not poverty in Syria, but you will not see homeless people, because the idea that somebody who's poor is poor due to their own fault or their own moral failings, that's not an idea really that exists in that corner of Syria. And there's family structures, there's communal structures, all sorts of different ways to keep people alive, essentially. So, there's so many ways in which it's different. So I'm working now on the coronavirus response in that city. There is a lockdown in the city, and people are mostly complying with the lockdown, and they're steeling themselves for it, and they're not having the kinds of debates that we're having here as a consequence.
Patrick, I was thinking, we were talking earlier about one of the differences that you observed when you learned about a service that was being held in Italy. Would you just sort of recount that episode and what that tells us about the differences between maybe our own context and yours right now?
Yeah, maybe a little moment of levity that I'm not really sure what it says, but there was an elderly priest here. This is maybe a week and a half ago. I'm in northern Italy, in Milan's in northern Italy, and this is just east of us near Bergamo, which has been the hardest hit area in all of hard hit northern Italy. And this is an older priest there. A number of elderly priests have died of the virus, and as have many others, of course. And this older priest decided that he was going to recommence doing masses, even though this was not to be done. Now, to give him real credit, that did not mean inviting everyone into this church. He is pastor of a massive church here. And so he invited maybe 30 or 35 people, gave them all masks, and had them sit 10 feet away from one another. And he's up there giving his homily. And while he's there, the Italian police come walking in and are not pleased with what he is doing. There's a whole series of confrontations which lead to the police officer stepping to the side and then coming back while the priest is saying the consecration over the Eucharist with a cell phone in hand, saying, the mayor is on the phone. He would like to talk to you. And the the priest's very Italian response is, I cannot speak with the mayor right now. I am speaking with God at the moment. So this is just this kind of the willingness to argue, the willingness to engage, the laughter that's in the midst of this, the anger it's willing to be shown in some ways rather than kind of like pushed down or be ashamed of or something like this. It's a different place. But I want to tell two stories that are both Italian, that are a little bit Italian, but they're really more historical. So, we can learn to be imaginative, not just by our own devices. Great creators are not just imaginative because they happen to be born this way, or they spend a lot of time alone in a room just thinking. You look at differences and you experience strange things. And that's part of what travel can be about, or pilgrimages, something like this. But history can provide the same thing that travel can provide. A comparison that's helpfully, beautifully different for us. So two quick stories for me about pandemics in our own history that can teach us how we might be able to be imaginative. The first is an old one that happened in the 3rd century in Northern Africa, end of the Roman Empire, 4th century, and swept all the way across the Roman Empire, killed many, many people, may in fact have been related to a version of Ebola or something like this. So we've seen outbursts of the same kind of a plague here. One of the bishops in Northern Africa during this plague took it upon himself and upon his community, now this would have been a much smaller Christian community there, to challenge himself and his community rather than running away or putting distances and barriers up between themselves and plague victims, to run towards them and embrace them. And there are lots of historical places where human beings as a species, beyond Christianity, beyond Catholicism, can go to look for the origin of our hospitals in contemporary ways. But this is one. This is one of these places where we have historical record of a leader of a local community standing up in front of his own community saying, do not remove yourselves, go towards them. And this is that imagination. Something happened in him to help him challenge his own community. Now, obviously that's not our response now, but we can be equally imaginative. Second, here in Milan, the late 16th century, the archbishop at the time, who was buried in the cathedral here in the Duomo, which I was able to see his body right before the quarantine began in full force. When a plague swept through Milan, his initial response was the kind of traditional Catholic religious response. Now, he gathered people together in 3 massive processions throughout the city where they're singing together, they're praying, he's doing, they're begging God for a cessation of the pandemic. But just like now, they learned during this that the plague was passed by proximity, by contact. And so this is the 16th century. Instead of being stubborn and saying, no, God will produce a miracle that will save all of these people, Carlo Borromeo, the archbishop, says, we're going to stop all these processions. And he stops them all. But instead of then stopping the prayer as well, he is the only one left in the city. All the governors have left. He's the only leader. So he says, everyone go back to your homes, quarantine, stay in place. But instead of leaving them alone there, he also has printed a massive run of Liturgy of the Hours, this Catholic breviary. And he has these distributed throughout the place. And every hour or a couple hours, few hours, the bells of the local parishes would ring and people would step to their doorways, their balconies, and they would sing to each other the Liturgy of the Hours across the doorways and across the windows. Now, look, that may not be our way either. I mean, I really agree with Anand. Like, it is not a sufficient response to bang our pots and pans at the doorways. It's not sufficient, but it is also not completely insufficient. It's not completely insufficient. It begins to build the kind of community that can imagine another world and then enact it. Both parts have to be there, but we can learn from these things. The hopelessness of our own lack of imagination, that is the thing that I think we must challenge in ourselves and in one another during the midst of this.
That's gorgeous. Thank you. It is a live question in the US still, whether there should be exemptions for houses of worship to bypass the shelter in place and social distancing rules. And a recent poll showed that 77% of Americans don't think that churches and houses of worship should have any exemption at all. And that cuts across party lines, which is encouraging. And yet we've seen the governors of Florida and Texas have lifted those rules for houses of worship. We've also seen some pastors and other religious leaders, and religious groups very hard hit. Church of God in Christ, predominantly Black Pentecostal denomination, has lost dozens of pastors after they continued to gather through most of March. The Washington Post had a story recently about a Virginia pastor who refused to halt his annual pilgrimage to New Orleans during carnival season to preach, and he came back and didn't make it home, died in North Carolina of COVID. We saw Blasio again in some trouble with Hasidic Jewish community the other day after 2,000 gathered to celebrate a funeral. We've also seen in India, Muslim missionaries gathered for a meeting, and their meeting was deemed a vector, and so they've been ostracized and blamed for the pandemic as super spreaders. So how, maybe Patty first, how do you must be in contact with those you minister to who want to imagine an exemption or who want to continue to worship, continue to practice regardless of what rules in place might limit that. And I'm just wondering if there are other examples of what Charles Borromeo did that you see happening, or that have you been in any kind of pastoral conversation with people who feel bereft of their worship, bereft of their traditions, who want to do something regardless of the rules that might be in place against it?
Yeah, Tracy, it's a great question, and let me try to take it in a couple directions without talking too long here, which is always my bent. The first is this: I do think there are interesting things being imagined in the Catholic community, which is the one I know firsthand at the moment. I'm sure that's happening in other communities too. I don't mean to be exclusive in that way. A couple examples we've seen around the United States. Maybe some of you out there have seen the photos of a mass that was held at a drive-in movie theater, or in a parking lot that ended up looking like a drive-in movie theater. And this kind of thing I think is really interesting and innovative. So nobody gets out of their cars. There is not that kind of distance there. That's really interesting. I've also seen drive-through confessions, where people will come up in their cars and the priest will be sitting a little ways away. We have not managed to construct a beautiful confessional box yet to figure out how to do that with a car, but maybe that's the next step to do these kinds of things. But I also think that local people, like local groups of people, are just rediscovering aspects of the tradition that they've just been temporarily forgotten, and maybe now they'll be temporarily remembered. And that'll be fantastic if that's the case. So, and a quick example is, I'm actually gonna say Mass over, I have been saying Mass for a number of communities over Zoom on the weekdays and weekends, which has been an incredible gift. But this weekend will be an interesting one, because this is a group of all lay people who have gathered themselves to pray the readings for Sunday, and then to do faith sharing every Sunday morning over Zoom with each other. And they don't have a priest normally who can gather with them, even though these are devout Catholics, are practicing, the priests are doing other things, and there just aren't very many of us now, to be honest. So this is the kind of thing that people are inventing new ways, or rediscovering old ways of living their traditions. This kind of stuff to me is very exciting, because old practices reinvented and having new life breathed into them never mean the same thing in the present tense that they meant in the past tense. That's really exciting. Like, it's really exciting, especially for a Catholic church that's like, it's a great gift. We've got all this tradition, but we've also, there's a lot of fear in the use of that tradition, at least in the American church, how it gets used, towards what political ends, towards what ecclesial ends. We don't have to think about that.
Oh, I was going to say, can I jump in here? Because we had a question from one of our viewers, Michael Bush, asked, and others have been wondering about this too, particularly within the Catholic community. How do you get around this, the communion, the sacrament? Because unlike in a Protestant denomination or someplace, you have to have a priest there administering that, and you can't just do it at home with Kool-Aid and off the base and say, well, we're going to call this good this week.
Yeah, that's exactly right, John. And to be honest, I don't think that the embodied character of the Catholic faith is going to change anytime soon. Like, that's not going anywhere. What is being rediscovered are interesting ways of diversifying that practice. Now, what I'm experiencing is this: it's not that we can't do other things and new things. It's that the experience of the gap that people are having right now. Like, let me just share my own experience. When I sit here, right here at my desk, and I set up all the stuff. Look, it's right here. Like, they just keep the stuff for Mass right here behind me. And so I set this up right here. And after the consecration, I elevate the host and the chalice right here on the screen in front of people that I'm doing this. Now, it's a gorgeous thing. It's a beautiful thing. But the people who I've been celebrating with, I've just tried to listen to a number of them share the experience of the gap that they feel between the visible host and the consumed one. And that gap is painful, and that pain is a consolation. It teaches us what our desires really are, rather than falsifying them. So can we be more creative with all kinds of digital stuff and invent new? Yes, we can do that kind of thing. Are human beings still embodied creatures that need to touch one another and be in ourselves and with each other? Yeah, we are. That's not going anywhere. So I want to let go of the other part of what I was going to say and let Anand say some beautiful things.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about a conversation we had earlier about the communities that you're in touch with in Syria and Afghanistan, there's no call to prayer sometimes because there's no one in the mosque to do it. What have you observed, particularly during Ramadan, about gatherings and worship that is different now, and how are people dealing with that?
Yeah, it's difficult. Ramadan started a few days ago, and people are having to deal with the fact that they can't gather. But in Syria, particularly, again, this is not something new for Syrians. I mean, they have had to deal with situations where they have been under siege, where going out to get bread or to try to go to the mosque means you're exposed to a sniper or airstrikes. So they have developed various means of having to survive in this circumstance, not as technologically sophisticated as some of the things that Patrick is mentioning, but smaller ways of gathering, gathering in homes, for example. And Afghanistan is a more difficult case just because there isn't much else in the rural countryside except for the mosque as a collective space. So I think it's people there would be facing a greater challenge, but partly because of that, there hasn't been the same lockdown in the rural countryside there as there is in places like Syria. But I think this speaks to a broader question. You mentioned India and how Muslims there, or this one particular Muslim community, is being blamed for being a vector of the virus. And it's interesting the way in which the virus and the pandemic kind of is like a Rorschach for whatever biases you may have already had. So of course in India, Muslims have been bearing the brunt of a pretty horrific campaign by Hindu nationalist government for the last few years, and that's been in pretty high intensity. And I was in India just a couple of months ago, and it was pretty scary to see some of the things that are happening there at the time. Here in the United States, I think there's also kind of a subtle bias that is played out, especially on this debate about whether these religious communities should be holding services or not, which is, I would call it, at least from where I'm sitting in New York City, a type of secular bias, which kind of sees religious activities as fine if when things are normal, but doesn't actually see them as essential parts of human activity, which I think comes from this secular way of looking at the world that says that maybe once upon a time that was an essential part of human activity, but we've moved on from that, and now has its own sphere. And so then it kind of in some ways delegitimizes these activities and kind of trivializes them in a way. And so instead of having a debate about whether they should do this or not, a more viable way of looking at it would be like, okay, let's see how can we make these things possible for people in these communities under these circumstances, which is I think what Patrick was getting at too.
You also mentioned that at the churches where you are doing some work in the Bronx, people don't have Zoom, right? They don't have the technology that would allow them to participate in that way.
Yeah, the one church that I visited, they didn't have any kind of hookup like that. And so, but they were still doing activities, but mostly it was going around and handing out food to people and having small prayer circles. There's a community garden, for example, where they were meeting.
So I'd like to venture into a little bit of theological territory, which we don't often get to in public universities. But there's sort of something about the moment, and each of you have hinted at it in a way that says, kind of our traditional roles and ways of examining questions or our ways of understanding our crafts maybe aren't quite adequate to the moment. And we need to be willing to go beyond some of our comfort zones. So I want to ask a little bit about this, and maybe fair to start by asking the priest, but I'm really interested in Anand's take on this question too, in light particularly of what you've just said. So this is just a general question about different religious beliefs about God's presence in a pandemic. And on the one hand, I think, from a sort of pastoral sense, we see how the physical distancing increases the need for spiritual proximity, whether that's vertically with the divine or horizontally with one's others. But there's also a lot of questions out there, kind of existential questions, and I think they also take secular forms too. So this is not simply a question for the religious believers in the crowd. I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people are wrestling with, which is kind of, why is God allowing this or inflicting this on us? Why does God allow this much suffering to happen? And there's a kind of traditional response to this, or it almost becomes a caricature that says, well, this is a kind of a form of judgment, of a divine punishment. But I think that maybe slips too quickly past some important terrain that we need to think about and cover. So I'd like to start with you, Patty, and ask you to, you don't have to put on your collar, you're already wearing it. So how do you come at this question when people bring that to you? In our languages, we call this theodicy, the theodicy question, the explanation of evil in the world. But it's basically a very human question. Why does this happen if there is a good and all-loving God out there?
Yeah. It's a question. The first thing I always want to say in response to a question like that is like, yes, like, thank you for asking. And because I think that the real thing that I get angry about, frustrated about, is the refusal to entertain the question of the living question of whether or not our lives are meaningful or not. And I think to come back to Pope Francis' language about this being an apocalyptic moment, one of the things that's being revealed is the insufficiency of our tactics for suppressing that question in ourselves. Like, there's just not enough Netflix for us to watch to keep the question down. Like, it's just not going to stay down. And I think that's a fantastic thing. So I want to say good first. The second thing I want to say is, like, everyone gives an answer to that question with their lives, regardless of the answer we give with it intellectually. And it's the question that we give with our lives that I think is actually much more interesting or much more beautiful. Maybe not much more, right? But it's there, that we have to pay deep attention to. What are the things that we do, and what do they say about what we actually think is meaningful in our lives? So let me make a third point out of that, and then try to tie that back to what a Catholic response to this question of theodicy in the moment might be. The third point is this. I think that the key to understanding Pope Francis's papacy and the way I look at, in fact, our last three papacies, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, as this kind of triptych of people who are trying to lead the church in really interesting ways. Like, we could talk about the details of those things. I'll leave those aside for the moment. But what he's really trying to bring us to, his gift that he's trying to bring to the church, and I think maybe through that to the world, attention to the most vulnerable and the poor. And he has been relentless in doing this. He did it at the Urbi et Orbi address that I mentioned just earlier. He did it by the fact that his first trip outside the Vatican was to the small island of Lampedusa, right off the coast of Italy here, where many refugees are washed ashore from Africa. He has been relentless in pushing and pointing this out to us. Why? Because he thinks that the face of Christ is encountered in the poor. What that means with regard to the question of the meaning of life is that we should look for an answer to the question of what does the pandemic mean, which is not the same question as why did God allow the pandemic, just to point that out, right? What does the pandemic mean? By looking to the face of the poor and seeing what is revealed there. Francis just gave this incredible interview in a magazine called Commonweal just the other day, maybe a week ago. And the interviewer there asked him a question along these lines. And one of the things he talked about in the midst of this is he said, kind of a beautiful phrase. He said, poverty is bashful. It hides itself. It seeks to hide itself. I know that's true. We know that's true for material poverty. We seek to hide those places where we are insufficient to the standards that we've set up for ourselves in the Western world. But it's also interiorly true. We seek to, poverty is a bashful thing, and it's uncomfortable and it's difficult. one example of the ways that poverty is a bashful thing, but is being drawn out and to be encountered in a beautiful way at the moment. There are lots of ways it's being encountered with pain, but here's a beautiful example. There's a small group here, a religious group, Catholic religious group in Italy called Sant'Egidio. They're a Roman group, group of lay people. They're really dedicated to friendship, really the charism of friendship. One of the focuses of their friendship is friendship with the elderly, especially the lonely elderly. And what they've been seeing is that the kinds of things that many of those who are elderly deal with, loneliness, isolation, consequent depression, physical health problems that are a result of all this stuff, the rest of us who are often immunized to that are starting to experience loneliness, isolation, consequent depression, physical illnesses, as Anand mentioned, temptations to suicide in wildly talented and valuable people. If what we are realizing here that this is already happening on the ground level, what Sant'Egidio has been trying to do is to use interesting technologies, right? Or even visits at a distance to maintain their friendships with the elderly. Now we should just learn from this and figure out how we are going to maintain these kinds of friendships that undo the kind of isolation that we've produced as some kind of good in our Western world. Like, I just do not understand it. Like, maybe I'm the strange person. I probably am the strange person, but I do not understand our tendency to want to create, mini castles that are separate from everyone else around us, that we can, produce a perfect lawn in front of. And I do not think that's what our hearts actually want. And I think this is part of what's being revealed to us here.
Mm-hmm. Anand, I want to get your take on this, but just before that, I want to remind our audience, please feel free to submit questions if you have them. We will also open things up, but please, if we don't get questions, then that means that, well, we just have to keep talking here. So, but Anand, please, if you would, could you come in on Patrick's point there? And I'll also be interested to hear your own views, sort of thinking about, this idea that sometimes there's some kind of judgment or punishment at work. I mean, that's found in other traditions. It's not just Christian, right? I think there's been some discussions of this in particularly as a Ramadan approaches. But you also hear kinds of ideas about like almost this, it's a secular kind of cosmic justice. You can hear it in our own society. Oh, well, so-and-so went to church during social distancing, you should, God's going to strike him down, or you deserve it, right? Just sort of in a kind of, it comes around, goes around time. And this is what you do. You deserve to die. That's not actually that different from some of the kind of ardent, explicit theological claims, right?
Yeah, and that was what I was getting at before when I was mentioning the secular bias and some of the ways in which I think people are speaking about this. And and thinking about why this is happening, there's like a proximate explanation, which is this very straightforward one, in my opinion, that has to do with the priorities that I described before. There's a distal, deeper kind of question, which is, I think, what you're actually getting at is why is the world structured in such a way that this would even happen? And, I think one of the things for me personally that I found is that we as a society and we as individuals are very scared of teleology and having some sort of goal-oriented life, even as an individual or as a community, right? I think one of the foundational assumptions of our society, and by our society, I mean like the Western societies in the last 200 years, is that we're not actually supposed to talk about goals for communities or for individuals. Everyone's free kind of just what's important is you have the right to choose what goal you want, right? But to actually think about goals for a community, that's not something that's really discussed. And so I think that's why it becomes so hard for people to at least articulate what it would mean to have a meaningful life, because we're just not used to thinking about it. But I actually really agree with Patrick that they still do articulate it in their actions and in the lives they live, whether they realize it or not. And so that's kind of how I look at it. The Greeks said something like, the only happy man is a dead man, because you really can only know if you're successful at the end of your life after you've completed all your journey in life, and you're able to look back and see if you've accomplished and flourished in the kinds of ways that you set out to do. So that's my own personal way of looking at it.
Good. We do have some questions coming in from our audience. So why don't we take a minute and turn to some of those? And if Sarah, do you want to join us here?
All right. Hi. Brilliant. So we've got a question from Terry, and this goes to you, Anand. President Trump invokes a language of war when discussing the pandemic, using quotes like the invisible enemy, saying that we are at war with the virus. Do you think that this language is helpful for pandemic discourse, and why or why not?
You know, it's funny. I was literally sitting in this very room like a month ago and wondering if I should do anything. And I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking, and I was saying, well, it's really dangerous out there. But then I think it was that day that Trump came out and said, this is a war. And I thought to myself, well, I am a war correspondent. So I should go out there and see. Well, I think that, you know, it's interesting. And the reason why I brought the parallel earlier to the pageantry of banging on the pots with the ways in which we ask to support our troops is I think there is an underlying connection between the two, which is that there's an emphasis on the sort of forms of showing support, but actually not the substance of it. And if those forms can help us reimagine a better world, that would be great. But I worry that they actually substitute for and do a different type of work that actually don't actually allow us to ask deeper questions like, if we were actually going to go to war, what does that mean for our soldiers and for the people that we're fighting? And given that in our society, we don't have those kinds of conversations, I don't think it's helpful that this is that Trump took on the language of war.
That's great, thank you. This other question comes from an anonymous viewer, and I suppose both of you could answer it. So how do faith leaders, priests, rabbis, imams, etc., help individual and faith communities heal from the many losses that we've experienced once we have the opportunity to gather again? What do you two imagine sort of going forward the healing process will look like?
Patrick, why don't you start with that one?
Okay. It's going to look like lots of different ways. I mean, okay, let's take this on like a democratic or political level first. I mean, crises provoke all kinds of different possibilities in democracies. And I'll bring this back down to a church ecclesiological level, these kinds of things. But one of the things that can happen in terms of during a crisis is that people can construct new, beautiful possibilities that let's take Hannah Arendt's famous term that we want to build better houses for freedom. This is what's possible in the midst of a crisis. The things that had been stabilized are now no longer stable. That allows things that were there to be shifted into new positions that can be built. What's also happening right now, though, is that this instability is not producing new houses for freedom. It's producing new autocracies. This is happening all over the world. I think there are something like 50 countries that have postponed elections because of all this kind of stuff. We've seen the grabs for power by major political leaders all over the world, being the most obvious example of something like this. That same duality that is present in a political realm will also be present in religious realms or other. And I think that we can see what we hope to be able to see is that religious communities, I mean, look, they're going to react in one of these two ways. We're already seeing it around us right now, that people are trying to take control. They're resisting, efforts at obedience or whatever it is. They're standing on the steps of state houses. Some of those are religiously motivated actions or explicitly religiously motivated or otherwise. But we've also seen lots of other interesting things, beautiful things. For example, here in Italy, Anand mentioned earlier that there's a tension between the secular governance structures and the freedom of religious communities that are happening at the moment. That's happening right now because the descaling of freedoms or the opening up of freedoms in Italy is happening at different paces for different things. And it's become quite evident. In fact, there's an ongoing debate in Italy at the moment that churches are not considered essential services, even in Italy, even here. And so letters are being written now in public to the editors of major newspapers and as well as to political leaders saying, this is a backwards way of thinking about things. Now, notice what's not happening. People are not gathering together to distribute the virus, right? Pope Francis has been having many conversations about this. Major religious leaders are writing letters to the major newspapers, the New York Times of Rome. But at the same time, Francis, the next day, after these kinds of things came down, at his homily in the morning, said he asked the church for two things. He said, I ask all of us for prudence in our decisions and obedience to those who are in governance over us. Now, look, that's an incredible thing for the leader of the largest single religious body in the world to ask of his people for temporary obedience while still pushing for this stuff. If this is going to happen, that's the kind of path that will lead to some kind of healing. Persistence, prayer, real discernment, imagination, and creativity. Now, a lot of that only happens from a religious lens on the other side of confrontation with the trauma that we've experienced and people have experienced on all kinds of levels, facing the sadness and the insecurity of those things. For me, as I said before, one of the things being revealed to us here is our actual dependence on one another, that we are not, in fact, as privileged as we thought we maybe were. If religious communities can help, knowing that it's okay for us to be dependent on each other, that will be a wild success.
Yeah, Anand, can we hear from you?
Yeah, sure. It's one thing I've noticed over the years is in countries like Syria, if you compare it to the United States, you don't see PTSD in the same way. Of course, people are traumatized and are suffering psychologically in so many ways in Syria, right? But I've never noticed like people who've been through war, who have faced the worst effects of war, expressing it in the same ways that it's being expressed by people who are coming back home from fighting overseas wars in the United States. Part of that probably is just a cultural difference of way of expressing, but there's something deeper here, which I think is that I've noticed that when people are going through trials and suffering together collectively, that confers a means to be able to cope in a way that I think some of us in our society don't necessarily always have. So you have people who are coming back, and then especially soldiers, if you think of soldiers who are in a very communal collective experience and then being thrust back into something that's very atomizing and fragmented and isolating, you can imagine the ways in which people actually suffer alone individually, whereas in Syria they suffer together. And I think that makes a difference.
Perfect. That kind of leads into our next question, which to my knowledge so far is our final question. Again, please feel free to post them in the live chat section just on the side of this video. But confronted with our own end, in our current context, what responses have you seen from religious or secular groups regarding humanity, sort of the ways that we accept and extend humanity to one another? Any comments on that in general?
Who wants to start there?
And then I think I might like to hear. I was going to say, maybe you ended with a very arresting image of PTSD survivors in Syria suffering together, and PTSD, or so it's not PTSD, it's something else, some other way of processing trauma. And then in America, people who come back from war suffer alone. And the question that we got from an audience member had to do with humanity. How do we show humanity to one another? These seem to be two very different ways of being human together versus being human alone. Most of us will have had our fill of aloneness, of being human alone by the time this is over. And so maybe just to extend that observation a little bit, I think the audience member wondered how will this change our way of being human together? And I wondered what you might have observed or want to venture as a response to that.
Sorry, Tracy, I missed the last 10 seconds.
Okay. We were thinking about being human alone versus being human together. In Syria, people seem to suffer together in a different way. We suffer alone. We make a virtue of that. What do you think might change as a result of COVID in the way that we experience our humanness together or apart?
Well, I mean, I really appreciated what Patrick said about the apocalypse as revealing what already exists. I think that is what this has done. That's what Hurricane Katrina did as well. And I can think of many other examples, kind of pulling the rug out and showing what's actually underneath. And it shows the best and the worst of our society, I think. And I've already described some of the worst of it in terms of the ways in which we are treating healthcare workers, but some of the best of it, which I'll describe now. For example, in the Bronx, the people who are going around and delivering food are people who are themselves living paycheck to paycheck. These aren't wealthy people coming to this neighborhood and handing things out. They are people from within that community who are doing it. Some of them are religious, some of them are not religious, but they're actually both working together to try to keep people alive. And so there's, I think, on the one hand, a very visceral sense from some people that if we're going to get through this, we're only going to get through this together. And that's what we've seen in the Bronx. And so just as an example of how this distribution works is that you have various people from various housing projects who have collected food. Some of them have gathered donations, and then they take a van and then just go around to every single facility and then just hand it out and, keep careful track of everything and then try to get more donations. And it's just kind of happening on its own. It's like a mutual aid network or society that's developed. So I think that is, to me, is a powerful example of being human, but we need to be able to, I think, scale that up in a way and connect that to the broader questions of how we prioritize in our society. What are rights and goods in our societies? That's the part that's not happening that I hope can happen through this crisis.
I think that's well said. I mean, let me try to give an example from my own research that spans what can be this surprising gap between what begins as a personalistic response, a one-to-one response, and then somehow becomes something larger in a way that I'm not sure I quite understand yet, although in our research, we're always trying to understand these things that are puzzles initially. It's again from the San Egidio community. Let's just stay with them as opposed to going to another. As I said, there is a charism of friendship. And in some ways that may sound like a kind of banal thing. Like we all have lots of friends. Facebook, as we all know, we've joked around, we have millions of friends on there, none of whom can ask anything of us and none of whom we can ask anything, which I think just puts the lie to the term, right there. And that's a nice thing for us to be able to say. And I think that we can name it as accurate. It's more or less the case, right? That friendship, as Aristotle would say, right, is willing the mutual good of the other. So this is fantastic. But we have also fallen, I think, in America today, at least, of maybe a consumeristic version of friendship or something like this, where we will be good to another as long as it doesn't cost us too much. And that too much is a really slippery term. like a lot gets smuggled into that too much. And I laugh and I smile because look, I know how much I smuggle into that term. And I know some of how much I smuggle into there's more that I don't know, but we all do this. Like, I wish some of us were exempt from it, but we're not. That smuggling is what is challenged by the San Egidio version of friendship. Here's a quick story that I think maybe exemplifies this, and then we can talk about how it maybe scales up. They do work not only with the homeless or with the elderly, but also with the homeless in different cities and also with war situations and etc. But with the homeless, their real charism is to make friends with these people, which for them then means that these people are actual friends who have mutual claims on each other. I've seen this happen in my own time with them, where I will be at dinner with a couple who are members of the movement, and they'll say, okay, we have to go, and you don't want to be rude, right? But you're like, oh, I thought we were having a good time, like we were going to have another drink, and they're like, no, we just have to go, so we just got a call from so and he needs some help and this kind of stuff. And it's one of their friends who's homeless who has called them on their cell phone, which number they have, and has said, hey, I know this is a hard time, but can you meet me here? I just need this, and they're like, done, right? I've seen that in person. Another example is that, and we could all imagine doing something like this. This is one that I have a hard time imagining myself doing. while they were visiting the elderly in a nursing home over a number of years, this is in New York City at a nursing home there, they had become friends with an elderly African-American woman who was highly involved in the civil rights movement. She was a Baptist preacher. These are Italian Catholics, dyed in the wool, right? And so they become friends over the course of almost a decade, 8 years. And after about 8 years, this African-American woman says to the two of them, this husband and wife, Italian couple, look, I'm healthy and well here. And this place is not killing me in my body, but it's killing me. It's killing me. Like, I can't be myself here. Can you help me? I got to get out of here. And so instead of doing like what I would do, and it's like, yeah, I will definitely pray for you, right? J'accuse. Or maybe I'll even go a step beyond, right? I will make some phone calls. I will, and I do. We've all done that, right? We've really done that. That is plenty in terms of our own expectations for ourselves of what friendship means in America. Instead, the two of them sat down. They had two young kids at this time, one in middle school, one in high school. And the four of them together decided to invite this woman to come live with them. And she lived with them for 7 years to the age of 94. And even better to talk about a different model of what it means to be a human being. When they tell this story, they do not tell it with the undertone of voice. Hey, how great are we, right? You know, they do not tell it like this. Instead, their sense of it is of how much they miss their friend. This is what she was like. She was like, she did these things. She was funny like this. She was super annoying like this. It's like a real person. Okay, look, if friendship can mean that, what it means is that we don't have to live with the definitions of the world and of ourselves that we're settled with at the moment. Like, it's possible. Now, we have to have some structures in our lives, some liturgies, to be honest, whether those are religious liturgies explicitly or otherwise, that are going to build in us the capacities, capacitate us, habituate us to be able to feel the world in such a way that when I tell that story, I'm not talking about how great I am, but how wonderful my friend was. Right? That's another way of being a human being. It's possible to do that kind of thing.
Interesting.
Well, we have one more question that came in that I think we'll be able to squeeze in. And so, sort of looking towards the future again, in what ways might religious institutions need to change or adapt in the process of recovering from the pandemic, particularly for the purposes of serving those who retain that religious identity?
You want to take that one, Anand?
I'll be here all day telling you.
Okay, let me try really quickly here. Look, as Anand and I are both sociologists, one of the things that sociologists are highly attentive to often is power and how power structures our social conditioning. And you can hear that in the tone of Anand's voice and the incisiveness of his criticism of our lack of care for soldiers or for medical health professionals at the moment. It's a great gift that sociology brings. The consequences of that, though, is there can be this kind of subtle voice in the back of a sociologist's head that's always looking for an explanation that is structural in nature, that has some kind of like cause behind it. You know, like there's one thing, and I just don't know. I don't know if that's always the case. Like, this is why I say all that theory to set this up. The liturgy of the Roman Catholic Mass, right? The liturgy of the Eucharist has been radically altered, and as in the story I told, over the course of these 2 months. I mean, the idea that we have actually canceled public masses almost worldwide is astounding. And many people within the Catholic Church have not been happy. Like, there's been vocal opposition to Francis and all the bishops' decision. But what we can see from this kind of thing is that the structure of the Mass, no one person took that away from us. Like, there wasn't some power broker that says, this has to be changed. I'm going to manipulate my way into it. And then poof, like, it's not like that. But because that structure has been loosened, there's new space in the gaps for creativity to happen. And that's where those kinds of stories of, this really beautiful community of friends that have been meeting online, they're replicating the Mass on their own amongst one another. Now, I mean, some of you may know this already, but I'll tell you what it reminds me of, is it reminds me of the Japanese Catholics who for 2 centuries, between the time, between basically around the time of the suppression of the Society of Jesus in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, they were isolated. But instead of giving up their faith, they found ways to practice their faith together. So that when priests landed on the shores of Japan again, decades and decades later, they were met by a vibrant Catholic community that had no priests in it. Now, I'm a priest. Like, this is an incredibly valuable vocation for me. I'm not trying to undermine that. But you know what's more valuable? The body of a religious community, whether that's Catholic or otherwise. That's the valuable thing. So if we can imagine in this new time, see the shoots in this new time of that kind of growth, you know, I'm willing to have some of our structures reoriented to make that possible.
Anand, let me, as we start to wind down here, Sarah, I think we're out of questions. Is that right? We've gone through. As we start to wind down here, I want to give each of you just a final word, but in particular on this issue, Anand. You know, this has been, we've had 60,000 deaths, 200,000 deaths worldwide. This has been a really grim situation. But as you and Patty have both talked about, there are some hopeful possibilities. I mean, you know, these opportunities, and particularly, you know, you were talking, Patty, about the you know, opportunities to rethink friendship, or others have talked about the importance of rethinking the dignity of work, of who we define as our essential services in our society. I mean, wow, I remember seeing this one tweet of a garbage collector saying, I went out and did my job today, and there was something like 200,000 retweets and likes. And oh my gosh, man, we forgot that these are our essential workers, our grocery store workers, et cetera. Thinking also about the goods of government too. I mean, there's been a long, you know, political trend in our society about, you know, what's wrong with government, and, you know, but wow, we really do see how important some government services have been. What else would you add to this sort of new space that we've got here to rethink things, and to be hopeful, and to set things aright, even at this moment when things are so wrong? Anand.
Well, you know, I think priests and garbage men are definitely essential. I'm not sure sociologists are essential in any way.
You're essential, Anand.
But I think, look, you know, we can't begin to change ourselves and change our society unless we actually see clearly and unambiguously what is actually happening and what's wrong. And I think that is the one, if you want to call it a positive in this crisis, is it lays bare the workings of our society for good and for ill. And so we need to be able to apprehend those workings before we can begin to reimagine things. And so we have a space to begin to do that. For me, and we're talking about essential workers, I'm hopeful. Tomorrow is what, May 1st, I think. So tomorrow, it's May Day, which millions of essential workers around the world will be demonstrating, and some really essential workers, such as those who are loading boxes in Amazon and at Whole Foods and others, are actually going to go out and strike. And to me, I see that not as just something that's useful for Amazon workers, but it's actually a profoundly important moral act for all of us, because it reminds us how our society actually functions is with those millions of tiny acts that none of us really see, but are essential to keep us going. And so, you know, I couldn't have imagined a year ago that, I mean, Amazon, of course, is notorious for its working conditions. I couldn't have imagined a year ago that there would have been any kind of attempt to change that from within. And now we're seeing this tomorrow. So, you know, I think this is a learning moment for all of us, and hopefully we can make best of that lesson.
Mm.
Yeah, I really echo that, Anand. And hope, as Barack Obama and many others have said, hope and optimism are not the same thing. And we have to look reality in the face without fear. And I say without fear in a deeply, deeply religious sense for myself. I mean, look, it is no surprise that Jesus's most commonly spoken phrase in the scriptures is, do not be afraid. Now, I'd say this to myself as much as to everybody else, is that there is a reason that certain phrases are repeated over and over again in the classics of literature, whether those are the scriptures of a tradition, Islam, Hinduism, ourselves, or others, the great classics of Western literature or Eastern literature. There's a reason things are repeated. It's because we forget them and we need to hear them again. In other words, just to say it like this, like Jesus does not say, do not be afraid to people who are not afraid. He says it to people who are afraid. We have to be willing to see that first. I know it myself. It's uncomfortable for me to look the injustices and incredible inequalities of the United States of America in the face. It's not fun. I do not celebrate it. I don't want to talk about it because it hurts. But reality is not an enemy, it is a friend. And it is the path, the reality itself, confrontation, embrace of reality itself is the only path into a viable future where hope itself is something other than optimism. We can do this though. And there are signs, whether they're small or hopefully large, that this is possible. There are other signs as well, as I tried to say in our reality, facing the reality of the fragility of our democracy around the world. But those are not the only ones.
Tracy, what do you think?
I think we've reached the end of our allotted time. So I just want to say what an amazing gift to have both of you with us. Anand, I think journalists are essential workers, and I'm grateful to both of you for not relinquishing your vocation as journalists and storytellers, even under lockdown. And thank you so much for sharing those stories with us and sharing your insights and your very powerful human presence. We're humble and grateful. So thank you.
Thank you both, and you gave us great points to end on as well. So we will be having more events and conversations like this. So I hope that if you enjoyed this, and I can't imagine why you wouldn't have, but you'll join into to those events. So stay tuned. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.